Well, thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate it. This is the last of this season of the Locust Roundtables. Very happy to have Heather Diack here.
Okay.
As you all know, Locust Roundtables, or may know, are open format discussions on topics in contemporary art, and they're proposed and moderated by members of the art community in Miami and beyond. We are doing them 2 times a year, so if this is your first time to one, please make sure you sign up on the email list and come again. I also want to mention that this journal on the table is called Line Script Diary, and it's a component, sort of a project that's jumping off of the Locust Roundtables that has to do with the production of words in contemporary art contexts. So we're happy to present that. This is a project by Alan Gutierrez, and that's activating our library. And then I'm just going to let Heather take it away. So thank you so much for coming.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to do this. Being asked to think of a topic for the roundtables is really fun, and I've put together a set of slides that are here only for to prompt discussion, because I'm interested in what you guys think. I'm interested in having a conversation about the notion of everything, which I realize sounds enormously broad, but I see this tendency in a number of works of art, and I have some ideas about how to connect the dots between these things that might at first glance appear disparate from different time periods or artists that seem to be working in different ways, but I think there's something to it, and I think there's something very contemporary about thinking through the notion of everything as a concept, but also as a method and as a subject. So the starting point for this has to do with Arman, the French New Realist artist who I've always been interested in. On the one hand, I feel like a lot more discussion gets directed towards Yves Klein, who was, of course, his close friend, but also kind of his counterpoint in France in this period. The cover image for the invite is the invitation for Arman's show, which was called Le Plein from 1960, and so he shoves it inside this used sardine tin. What he does is fill up the Galerie Iris Clerc in Paris, just fill it and fill it and fill it, so that if you were to receive this invitation and go to the show, in fact, you'd get there and you couldn't go inside. So this kind of impossibility, and excess of material. His project in 1960 is in part a response to Yves Klein, a kind of riposte to Klein's very famous show from '58, where he sends out a number of invitations, does huge PR, and when people arrive at the gallery, it's ultimately entirely empty, and so he calls it the void, le vide. And if you were at this show, you get nothing except for blue cocktails in International Klein blue, so that you'd go home and you would pee Yves Klein. But other than that, it was about immaterial. So on the one hand, there's this notion of nothing in Yves Klein, but I want to think about this notion of everything, which can be in opposition to nothing, but also maybe it shares more in common with nothing than you might at first glance think. And also, everything is also attached to the concept of anything, right? That has really run through 20th century art practice. And especially in and increasingly in our consumer world. So just to take a look at a couple of other pieces that I'm thinking about, and I'm showing you here 3 works by Arman, who starts to collect other people's garbage. And sometimes it's anonymous, and sometimes it's named. And then he displays these in vitrines. So, elevating them to the status of art to be looked at and to be, to think about. But rather than it being a work that's about composition, it brings in this element of decomposition and waste and reclaiming waste. Just go through these different images. Clairefontaine is another group that often deals in this very post-conceptualist way with this kind of repeated performance of acts that have already taken place and using excess material. So taking a look at this piece, Redemptions from 2013, which this is an installation at the Wattis Center in San Francisco, where there's nothing on the walls, there's nothing on the floor of the gallery, there's only these clear plastic bags filled with disregarded cans that the artist collective Clairefontaine have taken from a local recycling station. And they hang there above. And then at different points of the day, they create these interesting patterns of light on the gallery floor. There's a lot at work in Clairefontaine, even in terms of the fact that their name, is an appropriation of the name for the notebook company, Clairefontaine. So appropriation, but also accumulation. One of the other projects that is I've been thinking about for a really long time that gets me into this kind of matrix of everything, nothing, anything, concept, subject, material, method, is the artist Douglas Huebler, American artist who in 1969, coming out of minimalism, makes this statement: "The world is full of objects, more or less interesting. I do not wish to add anymore." So this idea of the world already being entirely full, that inventing something new, adding something new, it doesn't make any sense for him at this moment. So as if he should not make anything, make nothing. That's 69. 2 years later, he makes this other statement, which then is a project that he pursues for the rest of his life until he dies in 1997. A project called, in short, Everyone Alive, where he says throughout the remainder of his lifetime, he intends to photographically document the existence of everyone alive. It's an impossible project, but for me, that's also part of the fascination with it. The premise that can't be fulfilled, but in fact, that doesn't undermine the importance of undertaking this kind of crazy thing. He then starts to organize the photographs in all kinds of bizarre categories: people who look alike, people who resemble people from artworks, and then he adds bizarre subtitles as well. So in this case, at least one person who may now be dead, or in the one on the lower right, at least one person who may be happy to be the subject of art. But I'm looking for these moments of excess and a contest about material, and I find this really fascinating, particularly since, he's a conceptual artist at a time where people are emphasizing the dematerialization of the art object. And he believes he's part of that, and he is, but at the very same time that he's disavowing making material objects, there's a profusion of actual material, namely in the photograph. So photography has a big role to play in this, and I'm thinking about photo again as subject, method, concept. This is a project by Eric Kessels where, if he's invited to a museum space, he takes all of the photographs that have been uploaded on Flickr, for example, within a 24-hour period, and just fills the gallery with the material. So here are these installation shots where the photos are not to be looked at, but rather to be immersed inside. Another view. more recently, I'm thinking about the work of Camille Henrot, the French artist, in relation to this, and something like her project Gross Fatigue, which was presented at the last Venice Biennale, and actually, wins the Golden Lion Prize for being such a fascinating work of art. And in this piece, which was shown at this new museum show, and this is the install shot here, she tries to assemble a 12-minute video about the origins of the world. And so, where did everything come from? But has anybody here seen this video? Yeah? Did you enjoy it? And what did you think? It's amazing, right? There's something so fascinating about this piece, and it's all on a video screen. So these hands are moving through the screenshots and great audio. And the audio, it recites clips from different religious passages, but also from scientific journals and things about the origin of people and things. But, it's also about this uncontainability, that what do we do with all of this information? How do we account for everything? And so even though these artists, I think, seem very different on the one hand, I think they're all working on something, trying to grapple with this. And of course, in an age of big data, trying to assimilate information is difficult, poignant, but also this key problem. It's never entirely assimilated in art. So here's another shot from Gross Fatigue. And gross, I think, is really funny, gross because big, the weight, the heaviness, the fatigue, the tiredness, which makes me think of contemporary life, and so maybe I'll stop there, and I've got other images, but just to kind of open it up. Maybe there are artists that you've thought of that might fit in this, or
Well, I just wanted to point to Olivia because I know that you've been thinking about big data for years now, and just maybe as any part of, maybe you could explain what that is a little bit, since you have a.
Sure, I wasn't expecting that. But, yeah, I did a program on art residency with the Department of Defense, and we brought in a couple of artists to kind of figure out how to demonstrate big data in a novel way. And big data basically is the speed and the size of information that we're dealing with today that is ungraspable. Mm-hmm. Like Twitter, for example, has, I don't know, billions and billions of feeds every minute. And so there needs to be new methods of bringing in that information, maybe like multi-sensory or projects like this. They kind of become a narrative rather than just like facts or data.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So what did you do in this?
I started working with Nicholas Lobo and Dylan Romer, and we got to the point where we were making 3D models of the data, so then we can bring in sort of a haptic component. And then I went off on my own and started working with haptic gloves, so that you can sort of tackle the brain in two different encoding pathways, so that while you're touching data and looking at data, you're sort of bringing in two senses at the same time towards the same objective.
Okay,
so then, in that way, you can like speed up memory recall and sort of bring in data without really kind of subconsciously.
And how did you choose the data? I mean, what data?
They gave us a lot of unclassified data to work with, but now I'm working with like Twitter feeds and like different sorts of whatever's available. But the idea is to like, how do you bring in data without the process of thinking about data, which is sort of ingested in a different way. Using a haptic glove is one of them. So when you're feeling data, you're not
much data there is available today? Or something like there's more data available.
Yeah, in the last 3 years, I think we've made more data than the whole history of humankind.
Right, which is like
Right.
pretty staggering. Yeah.
Right.
And it's
Data
exponential.
makers.
I mean, was the Department of Defense trying to get some kind of insight out of you, or was this just purely?
It was the first time they did sort of like an experimental, like, usually they just tell people what they need, and so they're so baffled by the amount of data that they just wanted new ideas. So they brought in a group of creatives to sort of see what they came up with. And they're pretty impressed actually with some of the artist projects.
One of the things that's really fascinating to me about what you're describing is, to start by saying it's ungraspable, and so therefore you actually make this haptic thing, right? To grasp, trying to make it physical, trying to find a way to be like, I'll get a hold of that, like comprehension, yeah. That's very cool.
Yeah, another way they're using is EEG technology, where they show you like 1,000 images in a minute, and you actually do intake all that information. But that's they're still kind of working.
Well, I got a quick question. Why not just create an algorithm, like a Google kind of thing that sifts through all this information, depending on what you're searching for?
There's no algorithm right now that's like strong enough to really deal with all the data available, or to deal with multiple sources and different types of data. So you have like a lot of data in video, a lot of data in text, and it's hard to have one algorithm that, like, if they did, I mean, we'd all be in a lot of trouble.
Right. That's kind of what you're saying, is that the only way to deal with this massive complexity is through something like very simple instead, or maybe that's an idea that's kind of interesting. Like I definitely speaking without knowledge here, but I know that there are, there's some sort of myth about an artist who, like, his final painting is to draw like one dot on the canvas, and like that one gesture is sort of representational of
Everything.
a lifetime of complexity or something. And then so there's this, like, everything is encapsulated in this tiny gesture, and it took his entire life maybe to arrive at that point where he could grasp that. It's just a weird idea that sometimes I think about with contemporary art.
Yeah.
It's sort of a little fable. But does anyone else have like a thing that works that way? Gotcha. Uh-huh.
You mean works the same way in the sense of trying to distill a lot
Distillation,
into...
yeah, and it, kind of in the same way that distillation, I mean, in terms of contemporary art, we're also talking about dematerialization, so literally disappearing. Objects disappear, they no longer need to be there to represent. We no longer need representation.
Right.
I'm still not clear because it's the internet, its very existence is the perpetual creation of information. And it's still like, we still go through search engine to sift through all of it. And it's constantly being like fed more information every minute, second that we're even sitting here. Yeah, but we're still able to, not all of it, but enough of it to comprehend,
Well, really, how much?
I don't know, as much as you can absorb,
But well, how about like a month or two ago, Darren Bader decided that he was going to make a sculpture that existed in the internet,
Okay.
and it was basically he started like a Kickstarter to raise like £330,000, and then that amount of money was going to be auctioned off at Christie's or Sotheby's.
Okay.
But whoever bought it didn't actually get the money. The money was going to be donated, but the idea was that this took a place inside the internet, and like a sculpture was then defined as anything that takes up a certain amount of space.
A certain amount of space.
Yeah.
Right.
Space on the internet.
That makes me think of that Jonathan Lethem book,
Chronic City.
Chronic City. Has anybody read that? It's really good.
What's it
It's
about?
it's so hard. It's
Smoking dope.
oh well, there's some of that, but there's also there's like this coveted object which is not really real, but is super. They're driven by like this thing that they want, and it sounds kind of like this.
like a MacGuffin kind of deal.
What's the pedestal that's been cursed by the...
Right, Tom Friedman has like a pedestal with a witch's curse.
Oh, right.
I think it's pretty interesting that, where we are as artists right now in this particular time, it's really, it more embodies what probably 30 years ago people were calling postmodernism, and this sort of real actualization of our inability to juggle everything, and,
Right.
and the kind of acceptance of it, but also the idea that there are people who administer this kind of data. Like, we were once talking about how crazy it was that Douglas Huebler made this impossible project that we're so close to actually realizing at this point that now everybody on Earth might actually be photographed.
Right.
Or we're very
Yeah.
close to
And will
to
submit
arriving
their
at
image
that-
themselves.
at that moment. And so, like, how does the concept of everything, how do we grasp it? How do we,
Right.
how do we begin to work with it? I think Camille Henrot is like the perfect example of an artist who, like, it's not just like this accumulation blindly, like in the kind of Arman way, but trying to administer it in this way
Right.
to kind of make it art. It's.
But it seems like the failure in these artist projects is really important, right? That even if it seems like they're after something comprehensive, ultimately what they want to point out is the impossibility of it, of having a totality.
Right.
Whereas, these kind of, whereas bureaucracy or even something like Facebook or Google Earth does seem more like the kind of counterpoint, which is like, no, we
got
want,
this.
we want to control the world.
Well, and I think they're so close, I mean, with the, omnipresent technology and, this idea that, there's drones in the sky, there's satellites, everyone is electronically, counted and in a database of one form or another. And so
So they really fail by succeeding.
they there is a counter to this, people who say, no, we can grasp this, and they're hiring artists to help them, or but it's, more scary than Facebook or anyone is probably military industrial and like what they're
Right.
going to do with it.
Right.
I think that there's a difference, though, theoretically, between if you're talking about stuff, like actual real objects, versus what is happening on the technology level. So the data that is being captured, either through these, massive computers that we have now, or even what some of the things that Google or Facebook or whatever is doing. Because I think that, there have been a lot of people who've come out and talked about the fact that, we might be close to grasping everything, but we're also close to outpacing our technology. So that, PDFs that we had 10 years ago, we might not be able to open actually in another 10 years. And so we're actually, like, there's a lot of people who are talking about, we might be at the brink of losing all of our past. So in essence, then we kind of don't have everything. And I do think that there is something tangible about working with things, objects, rather than dealing with ideas, which is basically what data is to sort of. So yes, you can, touch data in a way and play with it. I spend most of my day dealing with data, but it's different. It's I don't know.
What
That
about,
between that and touching something, right, and having a relationship with an object, we're not attached to code. Maybe some
Right,
of us are, but
right.
Yeah, but that's, I like your idea when you point out it's an idea, right? The touching and these concepts. But it's all becoming more virtual. We're talking about like people just creating worlds also. It's not just, in reference to gathering all this information, we have the tools and we're going to get better about filtering down to what we're looking for. We just have to ask for it. It's there.
Right.
Where this is what the future is. It's that kind of convenience, right? In reference to national inquiries, that's going to be inevitable too. once you're plugged in, that they could, whether algorithms will catch up, which is gonna happen, because that's just the way our tendency is. We're gonna find a solution to that problem eventually. And they'll be able to sift through whatever information. If they want to find out X's shoe size, they'll bring it up if it's online or in a database. So it's not a question about gathering a lot of information. It's a question of what kind of information you want and getting it instantaneous because it's available.
But
That's
also
where
being,
the future
yeah.
lies.
But there's
Or
still
is.
this kind of problem, and especially, in terms of, so the problem of differentiating between information, and especially in terms of art practice, right? Differentiating between information, differentiating between materials. I mean, the next artist I have here is Martin Creed, who, famously is like, well, I don't know. It could have, everything is going to be all right. I couldn't decide, so I wore 3 shirts. And on the one hand, he comes across as a little bit facile, but I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, when he says, I really don't want to be a wanker, I'm trying to take that very seriously, right? So that it's not just about being sort of, now I'm starting hand gestures, it's not just about being anything goes. There's something to it. There's some kind of discrimination, but at the same time, he is all about things. And I don't know,
It's
as
funny
an art
how
practice.
quickly we jumped from the idea of objects, just in this discussion to
Mm-hmm.
data, just right away, like away from the Arman accumulation of stuff, or even where we all are with just having all this stuff or collecting of those things, just quickly to this idea of like our, not everything, but our idea of everything, like every idea, or
Right.
things and ideas are, objects. Ideas are not necessarily objects, and stuff, things are not necessarily just ideas. They're, they could be, but I think that there's a difference between material and just thoughts or information. And material is probably actually finite, and I don't know if ideas are or not.
There's an important correlation between the two, of ideas and things, and how finite both are, and as we're paralyzed, how certain ideas gain a certain prominence, and then through the use of data and statistics and through control over objects, you exert a certain power over your subject. So,
And when things become virtual, are they all leveled out? I mean, are they differentiated? Or, whether it's a photograph of people or whether it is data, is this all just, it's kind of emptied, leveled?
Well, you pointed something out that's very important, is the discrimination of these ideas. Because I'm on the school of thought that objects represent ideas. And when you have so many objects which represent so many ideas, you have to discriminate. And everyone here is discriminating. We're sifting through all this excessive information that we're inundated with. We're doing it every single day. So
Do objects represent ideas, or do ideas represent objects?
no objects. An object's its very existence is based on an idea. Even if they exist right now, there's an idea connected to them, no matter what. That's why we give them names.
We might need to go back to
Different
Duchamp
names.
and have
Well, that's a Duchampian, yeah. I know. In reference to that, yes, but it's just my opinion, really. But it leads more to discrimination. We're talking about
Science agrees with you.
Well, that's the beauty of this format
Even
too.
contemporary philosophy is trying to deal right now with the idea of how tangible things are.
Right.
And so the new materialists and the new ways of seeing just ideas or data, they occupy spaces in our minds, and they make us experience certain kind of feelings during the time of their existence in our minds. And we segregate hormones, and we segregate substances internally that actually make us believe they really exist. Like for instance, if you can even have the chance of working after passing away, like Michael Jackson, you can have a hologram and you can have a world tour. You know, so and yet we experience and we believe he's alive, and they can create sort of some kind of algorithm in which he can have a feedback with us.
It can have some kind of form. Yeah.
And it's a 3D something.
Yeah.
And that 3D something somehow, even though it's binary code, that binary code somehow, by going horizontally in the computer processor, still translates into some kind of like a tangible object that we can experience. So if we talk about probably the immediate future of art is getting rid of a lot of material things, we're probably in the last frontiers of the artist making objects, physical objects, and maybe it's going to be something else. I don't think it's an extinction of art as a discipline per se. I think it's in the process of transforming
But if we go back to conceptual art, I mean, in the 60s, and the reasons by which artists were interested in dematerialization, those reasons were what? They were anti-commercial. They were about what else? Help me out. Like, what are the other reasons?
Why do dematerialize?
Politics, right? As of today, the premises are different. We already know.
Sure. So we've been through this in the 60s.
Exactly.
We've been through resisting these systems which commodify artist practice, and so we have this responsibility to now deal with the aftermath of that moving forward. And I think that there's an interesting artist that we've talked about a couple of times, that his work, if it's photographed, digitally photographed, it will like black. It won't give a real image of what it actually looks like online, so that it can't be circulated online. So that's like now it has reflective properties that don't allow it to look the way it actually looks in reality.
So it's
he's
like
now
this intervention,
that kind of circulation,
not to be assimilated in data.
into contemporary art daily, like
Right.
that's
Well, like even the writing reviews for exhibitions are subject to how well photographed the space is via digital.
Right, so now-
media.
Right.
If it's something that can be passed on, and you don't need to go to Stockholm to see the show, you just look at it in a 2D format, and yet you're grasping something.
But the reasons by which, I guess to bounce off what you're saying, is the reasons for the resistance today to resist being digitally circulated are different reasons, or are they similar reasons for wanting to have dematerialization?
Right.
I think that's really similar. I think that, the whole idea, we weren't going to make, the idea of the object was separate from any material realization of it. The art happens in the ideation of it, the sort of just having the concept of the art, and that anything that happened after that was sort of just the material embodiment, didn't really matter as much. But and then politically, I think we're not in a totally different political time. I mean, I think that if you look back and you read the things that those people were writing about, what those artists were talking about, the people who were writing about their art, it's like it really, we're in an echo of that. I feel like it's quite similar, and that our theories and our experiences are really a kind of just a magnification that they were seeing back then, and they didn't even quite grasp where these things were going, these dematerialization, not just of their own process, but of everything. It was a post-Fordist moment, and it was like everything was was becoming, an idea-based economy, an information-based economy, and we're in it now. We don't have the same relationship, perhaps, to it that they did, but they were foreseeing the moment we're in now, certainly. And I think that's why it's always good to go back and look at, the 80s and see how they were dealing with it, or
With appropriation.
yeah, and I think because it's Arman's practice stayed really similar through this whole period. And
Right.
he's still alive.
Yeah.
It's still the same, and I think that
Still
he's
collecting
like a
garbage
good
cans.
barometer of like how it still makes a lot of sense these days. And there's so many artists who make art
Yeah.
like that.
Well,
Like
we have like Rachel Harrison.
Diego
Absolutely.
Bianchi down at the
Right, down
Yeah,
at the
exactly.
Pam right
But
now.
then what are we
Yeah.
saying about that? So are we saying that, is Diego Bianchi and Rachel Harrison, are their practices,
Maybe I'll scroll forward.
invalid, or they missed the point because they are, fed into the commercial? Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I guess it's sort of so what,
Right.
what does any of this?
I'm curious, like, this idea, I was looking at a picture the other day, and it's this idea of the sublime. I think it was painted in the 1800s, and that, if as artists or as people, do we have the same concept of the sublime that people had 100 years ago? Or is it, I would say that is something that is really transformed. That the idea that we can wrestle with these things, even with algorithms and our spaceships and satellites and computers.
Known things.
It's different. We have a different relationship to. Even the way now we're skipping so quickly again from the material to the immaterial, very easily. We're willing to make that just there's no distinction.
Well, I think, despite the acceleration of the information economy, we didn't lose things. We actually made more things. And we made more things that were increasingly obsolete faster. And so it's kind of a myth that we're going to become totally virtual. Remember when people used to say, we won't need paper anymore? This is totally ludicrous. And that's just one very minor example. Stuff fills the world constantly. So
Well, you need the stuff to make the hologram.
true, right? The actual physical computers.
Yeah, but we do use less paper now. That's why print publications have gone online. They're not doing as much.
Right.
Of course, but the bigger point is that. What's the bigger point?
Well, it wasn't good.
Here altogether.
It stays as a novelty.
As you become more information-based and database, you still have to build bigger servers. Even though processing is getting smaller, you're moving at such an exponential rate. It's interesting to think about,
There's still giant hard drives somewhere.
Right.
Really, that's really where it is.
And I think there's, if you look at contemporary practices, there's people doing all these digital things, but there's also people, I've never seen so much concrete used in art in the last 10 years. And it's everyone's making things with iron and concrete, and they're not beautiful objects, or they're just kind of
Because they're very
clumped
basic.
together. And that's how they want to be. They want to be these things that just demand to be held and weighed and
Material.
accounted for.
But do you see the value?
Yeah, they're often beautiful bits of art. I don't know.
You're saying they're not all beautiful.
No, of course. I'm not saying that that's a standard. I'm just saying that
There's a
there are
tendency
things.
moving towards making objects of substantive.
Yeah,
object
Rachel
of-
Harrison or those
Rachel
kind of people
Harrison,
were
absolutely.
here's a photograph and here's its object corollary
Yeah,
or
or-
something like that. And
Then you think that's just a reaction towards.
I think to seeing our this dematerialization. Well, but also it's a at the same time.
Yeah.
But I would also say it has a lot to do with the economy. There's a lot of dollars circulating. People are like,
Absolutely.
okay, I got to make a thing right now.
And even at the early moment of conceptual art, there was still an abundance of material. Look at the archives and there's so much stuff.
It's the irony of.
It's totally.
Well, I would say it's funny, the way that a conceptual artist defined themselves back then. defined his or herself back then versus, saying like, I'm not gonna make anything or add anything to the world, to now being like, I don't have to make these things. I have an idea. I'm gonna have somebody else make the thing and put it in a museum for me, which is.
Or I don't necessarily even have to make it.
But I feel like it is because of the economy. Like, there is an object corollary. These days now, like, there's a team of fabricators. There's a whole industry based around making these objects for these artists.
Sounds common.
I think I interpreted the topic sort of.
Oh, good.
I mean, we're talking a lot about actual physical things, and we're talking a lot about ideas and intangible things that become things, and tangible things that come from ideas, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of obvious, no offense. I mean, I get why we're talking about it. But I more thought that your topic was saying we have everything to deal with now. Not just ideas, not just objects, but we have everything sitting on our shoulders.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't that it came out of nowhere. All of these things
Right.
have been things, ideas,
Yeah.
all this shit has been around.
Yeah.
We just know it now.
Yeah.
So maybe before the internet we didn't have as much awareness.
Right.
But now if you pick up a pencil, you're like, well, fuck, minimalism,
Oh, yeah.
modernism, I have all this shit to deal with. It's all there
Yeah, the
now.
burden, the
Yeah,
weight.
And it's also like, what's going on Facebook right now? Or like, what's going
Yeah.
on the other side of the world?
Yeah, but
What-
she
what is this
mentioned it
exhibition?
earlier, and that's the thing I come back to is the discrimination of these ideas. You have to sit there and sift through what you gravitate toward or what you feel is relevant to yourself and your life. And that's, but we have a lot of options now as opposed to in the past.
We have decision paralysis.
Yes.
But it's,
Maybe that's a better way of
Yes.
describing it.
But there is this kind of weight, which I think, even the title of the Camille Henrot, right? It's like the weight of the world. Like, what do I do with this? There's so much. How do I grapple with it? How do I make art with
How do you
this?
do anything? I need to
Decision paralysis.
No, but absolutely.
I'm
But then
serious.
the decision paralysis, another thing I find interesting about that in relation to this topic is, okay, so certainly a lot of this comes out of Duchamp, the idea that anything could be art. Not everything is art, but anything could be. But with something like Arman, he is making a choice to take the things that were not chosen, the refuse, right?
Right.
So it's the discards of someone else. So the opposite of selection. So it's kind of this intervention in the affirmative selection of Duchamp, as indifferent as he might have claimed to be. So something has changed. And that's why I think that looking back to Arman is kind of interesting. I mean, and bringing up someone like Diego Bianchi, that how do we discriminate amidst the weight, the burden of everything? I mean,
I agree.
It's like they're kind of not. I mean, like people struggle to make work after the Second World War.
Absolutely.
They realize the Holocaust, the way it was.
Right.
I mean, that's a burden.
but we still have that weight as well. I mean, that didn't go away.
It implies a condition, not a thing or a not thing, not an on or an off. It just is talking about the condition.
Is there a difference between the known and the unknown? And that it's not so much that now we're dealing with the idea of everything, but the fact that we think everything is known, or so many things are known.
So now we know how much is known.
Right. Well, but I guess like there used to be like this kind of religious impulse to say like we're gonna like deal with the unknown. We're gonna make that manageable for you, and it's gonna help you deal with that kind of paralysis, like how much kind of mystery there is in the world. But now it's the opposite. We're dealing with I know I'm probably going to live to be this old. I should eat this. I shouldn't go out tomorrow because it's going to rain.
But Aaron, I agree with your statement, which was that what we actually know, like especially if you approach it from like a scientific perspective, is just how little we actually do know. We've made amazing strides in figuring out the world, but there is like so much that we still, like it's an insane amount that we don't know.
What does this lead to? What Amanda alluded earlier was this paralysis that we're going through. Is it overwhelming?
I think it's overwhelming.
Horizon, it's more about being able to see what you're capable of, but
Right.
what is known. What is known is obviously a big thing.
Being
too.
comfortable also with not knowing.
The not know. Yeah.
In my experience, I mean, I'm just kind of touch on what you're saying. If you know what you're looking for, you can find it today, and it's all available. What's interesting about everything being available is finding things that you're not looking for, and finding new correlations and new patterns that you didn't know you needed or you didn't know that could affect you. And so, and that's sort of why they brought in artists into the Department of Defense, because they can find whatever they want to know in a second, no matter what it is, but they can't find what they don't know, or you can't they know it's all available, but they don't know how to find those things. And I think that's sort of like the beauty of art practice dealing with the everything.
Right. How to find the unknowns.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like art's like dogs running in the yard, they run the pathways and then they wear the grass. But I think we're like in a moment where, yeah, it's an interesting interpretation. I mean, anybody in any profession really.
Yes, also exhaustion.
Right.
This mental exhaustion that comes after just even imagine that you can access everything. And it's impossible. You don't have, even if you have 24 hours a day to sit and try to access that, it's impossible. If there's a moment when the brain starts shutting down. So I
And
feel
also, why
like
should you try if everything is even possible, like whether or not it's actually been done or not?
it's a beautiful state.
But that's the most exciting thing is when you
So
find
it's
something
if you
you're not
care.
looking for originally. That's when things start to become more interesting. When you sift through something, you find something that you weren't really, trying to find. It's like making these connections. That's what makes it really, really interesting as far as sifting through everything.
Right, and
It's
something
like,
that might be misfiled, or the algorithm takes you down,
something-
another
it's
rabbit
you're going
hole.
down the rabbit hole. Essentially.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Well, in terms of, contemporary art, I think that this notion of everything has become really prevalent. And one of the people that's writing about this is David Jostlett, who 2 years ago wrote this really fabulous article called The Aggregators. So about aggregate art, which is just about culling information, and he poses these questions: what do you do with it? And one of the, he wants to argue with Debord, and I thought this would be an interesting thing to bring in, because when Debord talks about the world being spectacle, all experience being subsumed by spectacle, it's a downer. Like that's paralysis, right? What do you do? If Debord's right, this is really devastating. And he uses the word accumulation, right? Capital accumulated. So there's a parallel to these questions we're talking about. But what David Jostlett says is, no, it is never as totalizing. No matter what the project is, it can never be as total as Debord proposes. And instead, he wants to talk about aggregation and precarity, the way in which information is still fragile, vulnerable. The images are vulnerable, like they're not these totally hermeneutic things that just lock us in and we're trapped. But actually, there is possibility. So it's a little more optimistic than the dystopia of Debord. And I think that is a kind of prevalent strain in contemporary art practice. So when you say looking for the unknown,